Hello, my noble band of outlaws. Outlaw Samurai coming at you live with a video. This is going to be a video response to Choir Boys Outdoors, or as we more affectionately call him in the North Sword and Knife community, Scab. Now, he made a comment in his latest video that some people have claimed that paper cutting is not a legit testing medium for knives, and by contrast, swords. And as you know, I focus mainly on swords, and Scab and Joe, they're more of the knife side of the blade community. I just wanted to make a quick little note here on my thoughts. Scab makes a lot of valid points on the tip testing, and I'll also get to that in a minute. But for the paper cutting portion, for those of you who say paper cutting doesn't determine a good test, you're actually not entirely correct. And I want to explain why. Because paper cutting, as we can see here, this knife isn't exactly the best, but as we can see, it will do it. Paper cutting lets you see just how keen the edge out of the box is. To cut paper smoothly and efficiently, one needs a relatively sharp edge and a relatively clean and not burry edge. Like so. As we can see here, if there's any imperfection at all on the edge, any slight dulling, any micro nicks, even the slight glinting that is on this knife, it won't cut paper and it will get snagged easily. So paper cutting is a means of seeing just how sharp and clean the edge is. This, by default, also transfers over to swords. Now, yes, sometimes the edge will just get plain stuck. The paper will bunch up and you won't get a good, consistent cut. But just the art of slicing this at all can tell you how sharp your edge is, or if you have any kind of nicks or any kind of glinting, which are slight little surface areas where the edge is blunted ever so slightly. If you look into the light and if you're looking at the edge and you see a reflective area where light is bouncing back, that's glinting. The second thing I want to bring up is the tip test. Tip testing in general. Now, on that note, I believe tip testing should be situational. If you're testing a knife that is purposely built for stabbing, or a combat knife, if you will, then yes, tip testing is a must because you're going to be stabbing into people. That's the whole purpose of a combat knife, is to stab and cut other people. But if it's a knife like a kitchen knife or a pocket knife, tip testing really isn't all that crucial. Simply because most of the time, pocket knives are used to open bags of Doritos or cut open boxes or the occasional cutting and peeling of fruit. Alright? Kitchen knives are pretty much used for the same purposes, except with a broader range of food spectrums. Now, I don't have any of my Bowie knives or anything over here at my dad's house, so I'm going to use the sword as a double analog here. Now, a sword, by its very definition and use, is basically, a sword is to combat knife as to combat knife is sword in this instance, where, let's just pretend that this is a rather large combat knife for a moment. If you stab into somebody and you hit thick bone, let's say you hit the breastbone or you hit a shoulder blade or you hit any kind of bone and that tip snaps off in the body, yes, it's going to be rather annoying for the person it got snapped off into, but at the same time, it shows that if the tip snaps off, what about the rest of the blade? Because the tip, by and large, is the weakest point of a sword or knife in this instance, because it's the place where the metal is thinnest. So if this snaps off easily, what does that tell you about the rest of the blade? Also, jockeying it up to sword, swords are meant to stab and slash. And something like a rapier, for example, which is predominantly used for thrusting, yes, rapiers can cut, I'm very well aware of that. Just not as well as this. This will always outcut a rapier. But my point still stands. Swords are also made to stab into things. And if the tip of a sword snaps off easily, what does that tell you about the heat treat and temper of the rest of the blade? Yes, it's really easy to overheat the tip of a blade in the heat treat and tempering process. And because it's so thin, it's really easy to snap that part off first. But 9 times out of 10, when a sword blade or knife blade breaks, they'll actually break closer to the center or near the grip where it's supposed to be the thickest. Most of the time, the tip doesn't break off unless direct pressure is put onto the tip, as in with tip testing. So I can see the validity of tip testing blades that are meant to be used to stab into things repetitively or stab deep into shit, like combat knives, like your combat stilettos, your military knives, your Bowie knives, because let's face it, Bowie knives are combat knives. Basically any of the work tough gear knives that Scab's reviewed, and also swords. So this has just been my little bit of a rant and thoughts on paper cutting and tip testing. I believe it was a good while back, 2-3 years ago, I made a paper cutting thing, so if you want to look through the analog and the bowels of my past videos, you can find that. But I just thought I'd make that little add-on that tip testing may be situational depending on the blade and the type of blade that you are testing, but paper cutting is a legitimate test for anyone wanting to see the cleanliness and the acuteness of your edge. Because anyone who's ever cut paper before will know that a dull blade will just rip and tear the bastard. And even with a razor blade, even with box cutter blades, those blades that are just one strop short of a Gillette razor, they sometimes get caught and won't cut through paper out of the box. It's happened to me a couple of times. when I was cutting paper out of boredom. So, in conclusion, paper cutting is, in my opinion, a legit test to see the out-of-box sharpness, the acuity, and see if the edge needs any kind of touching up. And tip testing is situational depending on the blade that you're going to be doing the tip test with. A pocket knife is not necessary for a tip test, mainly because most of your pocket knives, unless you buy a cold steel, aren't designed to pry shit open. And yes, I would buy the cold steel Espada in a heartbeat. Kitchen knives, not really meant to pry shit open, but I can see certain kitchen knives, like the knives you'd use to shuck a clam, needing tip testing. Or maybe some butcher's knives that are used as deboning fillet knives, perhaps, could require just a bit of tip testing, but nowhere near to the degree of tip testing that I would say a combat-ready knife would require. Same with the sword. Now, we don't really tip test swords in the sword community, simply because of the fact that, well, swords have a much more pronounced purpose, which is cutting, slashing, chopping, of course stabbing, and I've taken to doing some stab tests in my latest review videos. If you want to look at the Legacy Arms Nodachi for a prime example of the stab testing that I do. But the real reason I find we don't do tip tests as much in the sword community is simply because of the length of the sword blade itself. If we try to tip test these, then we would probably end up bending or snapping the blade. That's why tip testing knives is a thing, because knives generally have blades that are short enough and stout enough that the pressure involved in tip testing usually is transferred mostly to the tip itself and not midway through the blade. Yes, most of the pressure in a tip test is still here, is still located here and here. And in actuality, when you're tip testing, you're actually bending the knife in an S formation. And here's how. You're putting pressure one way, this way, and the tip wants to go that way. So you're actually bending the knife in an S shape, which is why most of the time the middle snaps before, well, the middle of the tang snaps before the tip does. I didn't intentionally want to make this like 15 minutes, but I just thought I'd get all my thoughts and ramblings out. So, as I said, until next time, I know a band of outlaws, samurai tells all y'all be crazy rednecks, be safe, use your weapons. Shout out to Scab and Choir Boy Outdoors. I have taken to binge watching quite a bit of your content as of late. Keep it up, my brother. See ya.